This is session 5, and in this session we're going to be talking about the Exodus, the grand event of the Old Testament. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their sufferings. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out to the land of a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way of the Egyptians are oppressing them, so now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." This grand event is the signature redemptive event in the story of all of Israel. It is the event that everything preceding it, everything from the fall of Adam and Eve kind of flows into this event. And it is the event that after the Exodus is complete and the people of Israel are through to the other side and the story moves on, it is the event that becomes the event from which all other things in the story of Israel flow. And it just doesn't stop at the end of the Old Testament story. This is the kind of event, because of its power, because of its redemptive nature and its mission, is the kind of event that flows right into the story of Jesus and into the pages of the New Testament. So, we are familiar with this event. I'm just going to tell the story of it. And as we listen along and hear the story, listening now to the greatness and the stretch of this event in both ways. At the end of the book of Genesis, Jacob, Joseph, and their family have long passed on now, and there have been many and multiple generations of people. 430 years have passed, and they have stayed in Egypt. During that time, they have multiplied exceedingly, and a new king comes to reign. The new Pharaoh gets a little anxious and becomes skeptical when he sees how large and how numerous the Israelites have grown, or the Hebrews have grown. His fear is that they are at such numbers that if they wanted to, they could align themselves with some of the neighboring nations who are enemies of the Egyptians and could with them revolt against all of Egypt. So he oppresses them with hard labor. But the result of his oppression is that the Israelites, the Hebrews, continue to be very fruitful, to multiply, to fill the land. And so the Pharaoh then mandates that as the Hebrew women are giving birth to their sons, the midwives are to kill them in the act of childbirth as soon as they know that it's going to be a male birth. Well, the midwives are fearful of God. They are themselves Hebrews, and they simply cannot do this. And so Moses is born. His mother is able to hide him for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she places him in a basket that's designed to be able to float on the water, and puts him in the marsh, in the reeds near the river. And of all things, Pharaoh's daughter comes out and finds him, and she takes him into her home, into her life, and she raises him as if he were her own son. Later in his life, as he grew, Moses saw an Egyptian beating up on a Hebrew, and he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. When Moses went back, there were two Hebrews arguing about some matter. And in fact, the Hebrews, knowing the story and witnessing what Moses had done to the Egyptian, the two Hebrew men particularly were very distrustful of what Moses would do and of his motives. And so Moses fled to the desert where he sought refuge and where he in fact married. 40 years after that, Moses had an experience where God appeared to him in the form of a flaming bush that was on fire but did not burn. God revealed himself as Yahweh, or I am who I am. And in that revelation, in that experience that Moses had as he encounters the living God, God commissions Moses to go down to Egypt, and God relays to Moses that he has heard the cries of the people, he is aware of their suffering, and that he is sending Moses to go down and to bring these people out of Egyptian slavery and into a place of promise that God would provide. When Moses goes down with his brother Aaron, and they initially confront Pharaoh and make the request that the people of Israel be released, Pharaoh responded certainly by not releasing the people, but by mandating that they would continue to make bricks, but now without the straw that they had been accustomed to using in making the bricks. However, the production would have to be the same every day. So as a result of this initial visit of Moses and Aaron to Pharaoh, the labor of the Israelites, of the Hebrews, is increased, and now they must scatter themselves about, gather up the straw, bring it to the place where the bricks are being made, and they could not come up one brick short on what they had always been doing. Ultimately, Moses goes back to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh refuses to let the people go, and God brings a plague on the Egyptians. Plagues that include things like turning the Nile River into blood, frogs coming up out of the river, gnats, mosquitoes, flies, the death of livestock, boils, hail, locusts, and ultimately a darkness fills the land, and there's going to be an incredible plague of death. The plague of death would come about as God visits the land, and he will bring death to all of the firstborn males, whether it is human or animal. And before God does that, he instructs the Israelites, each household, to take a 1-year-old unblemished lamb and to kill the lamb and take some of the blood and put it on the frame post or on the doorpost of their home, and then to take the rest of the lamb to roast it, and their family is to eat it that night along with bitter herbs and with unleavened bread. So the Israelites observe and they follow these instructions of God, and during the night God comes to the land. He passes over the homes of the Hebrews where he sees that there is the blood from the sacrificial lamb on the doorposts. But in the land of the Egyptians, there is great wailing and crying throughout the night as families begin to recognize that their firstborn sons are dead, that the cattle, the first of the cattle has died, and the Egyptians at this point in time realize that this power contest, this God of Moses, has in a sense defeated their own gods. And so God begins to prepare his people for the journey that they are about to take. It also just so happens that throughout all of this experience, the Israelites, the Hebrews, are able to plunder the Egyptians, taking their silver, their gold, clothing, and so forth. And along with that, they are bringing their unleavened bread, and they begin to gather for the journey that is ahead of them. God leads them through a desert road and ultimately leads them to a Red Sea. During the day, God has demonstrated his presence by a pillar of cloud that is in the sky. And at night, God has revealed or expressed his presence through a pillar of fire that leads and guides them. So as they are standing by the Red Sea, or the edge of the sea, Pharaoh has a turnabout on this entire thing, and he decides to send his chariots, 600 chariots. He sends horsemen, he sends charioteers, he sends troops out to pursue the Israelites, whom he is fearful now are on their way to escape. The Israelites are able to see that they are being pursued, so in the front of them they are facing the challenge of the Red Sea, and behind them they are becoming aware that Pharaoh has sent his army to pursue them. At that time, the angel of God and the pillar of cloud move from in front of the Israelites to behind where they are, in order to separate them from the coming Egyptians. During the night, the Israelites had full light, and the Egyptians were in full darkness. And as day began to come, God was preparing now his people for the journey that was to be ahead of them. Moses took his hand and his staff, and he held it out over the Red Sea, over where he was standing, and God sent a mighty, powerful east wind. In fact, that wind had blown throughout the entire night so powerfully that the waters were divided, and before them was now dry land. And so during the day, Moses led the Hebrews across the Red Sea through on dry land. The Egyptian army and the chariots began to approach, and as they came to the Red Sea, they too attempted to cross over, but God caused the wheels of the chariots to get stuck, and confusion broke out among the Egyptian army. When all of the Israelites had safely crossed to the other side, and while the Egyptians were in sheer chaos in the middle of the Red Sea, God then swept the waters back together, and in so doing virtually swept away the entire Egyptian army. And so to this point in the story, Moses has now confronted Pharaoh. God has shown up in the form of various plagues. Through Moses, God has led the people through the waters of the Red Sea. They have celebrated an initial Passover, and before they actually crossed over through the Red Sea, the Israelites consecrated their firstborn sons to God, and so their journey has begun. An exceptional and powerful story of God's redemptive mission, of His purpose, of the ways that He has engaged and encountered Pharaoh, the ways that He has used Moses. And in your conversation, you may wish to even just give some reflection on the reality that God not only used Moses, God also used Pharaoh in this. And so as you just kind of reread the story or recount the story, this story found in Exodus 1 through chapters 1 through 18, as you kind of just dive into portions of that story, and as you explore that together, you may wish to think about the ways that God, in fact, used Pharaoh in this story. And you may wish to think about one of the challenging things about this story, things like God hardening his heart, and how that just kind of plays out in the fuller scope of God's mission in the story. You may also want to think about the reluctance that both Moses and Pharaoh had at some point in time to participating in this redemptive story. You'll go back and remember that Moses himself had some deep reluctance about this whole thing, and I hope you'll just have some fun talking about Pharaoh, talking about Moses, and that God's redemptive event, this grand redemptive event, is going to happen, and it even involves individuals on both sides of it that have experienced some reluctance along the way. And talk about this confrontation. It's not just between Moses and Pharaoh. Ultimately, this is a showdown or a confrontation between the God, the Yahweh of Moses, and the many gods of Egypt. Starting with the Nile turning to blood, the very lifeline of Egypt, and ending with things like darkness over the land. And as you reflect on this, it would be helpful perhaps for you to know that of the many gods of the Egyptians, Re, R-A, the sun god, was the most significant of those gods. And when you consider the fact that this is a contest, this is a showdown between the Egyptian gods and the God of Yahweh, and you're looking through these plagues, think about the incredible significance that, especially as the last two plagues come about, one of them is darkness and the other is death. And as you think about this death plague, as it comes upon the firstborn males, think about the significance it has for the dynasty, for Egyptian rule, that Pharaoh's own son, his firstborn, the one who would succeed his father as Pharaoh, that God had now come in such a mighty way. He had so invaded Egypt that now he is altering forever the dynasty of the Pharaoh itself, with the tragedy from Pharaoh's perspective, or from the Egyptians' perspective, of the loss of the firstborn son of Pharaoh. So, I hope that you will just have a wonderful time revisiting this grand redemptive story. And as you do so, keep placing this story in a much larger context. I know you know the story. Now start thinking of it in terms of all that has come to it, how we got there. And then especially, and we'll be seeing this in future sessions, keep in mind always of all the things, all the redemptive activity, all of the ways that this story impacts and shapes the mission of God for all that is to come.